Hey everyone, I'm going to try and somehow keep us on schedule here. I'm Alexis Madrigal. I'm a senior editor at The Atlantic, where I mostly orchestrate our technology coverage, writing not just about startups, but sort of the history of technology, philosophy of technology. And I do a project every year called Startup Nation, where my wife, also a journalist, and I go to a part of the country and we just sort of drive through it and see what people are doing in places like Durham and Pittsburgh to sort of create startup ecosystems in those places. And one thing that we find is that there's just such an incredible diversity of opinion. There's sort of a folk wisdom about how startup ecosystems come about. And then there's sort of research and data and all these things, and it sort of seems like the truth actually kind of lies between those two. And so what we have here is we have doers on this panel, we have research-based people, we have people involved in different components of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So let me just introduce you quickly to them. Sitting here to my right is Adriana Cisneros. She is in charge of strategy for the Cisneros Group, and she's mostly focused on innovation through digital technologies. And as someone told me backstage, she's also been one of the big supporters of the entrepreneurial ecosystem here in Miami. Sitting next to her is Sam Arbesman. He's actually a writer for us at The Atlantic at times, but he's primarily a senior scholar at the Kauffman Foundation in Kansas City. He's also the author of The Half-Life of Facts, which is a fascinating book. And his work is kind of focused on the mathematics of complex systems, like, say, a startup ecosystem. To his right is Eric Toone. He's a professor of chemistry at Duke, where he also is head of its Innovation and Entrepreneurship Initiative. And he actually helped stand up and lead ARPA-E. Are people familiar with that? It's sort of, I think, this is just me editorializing, one of the best research institutions for energy to ever be created in this country. And that was in part to Eric. On the Skype, I don't know if everyone can see him, there is Brad Feld. He's a venture capitalist, managing director at Foundry Group. He's invested in a bunch of companies that you've heard of. And he's also the author of Startup Communities, Building an Entrepreneurial Ecosystem in Your City, which could not be more applicable to this panel. I think I want to start off with Sam. You've done some research on sort of geography of startups. Maybe you can just sort of like tell us about, so what does it really look like across the country, and is it all really concentrated in Silicon Valley and New York or not?
Well, first of all, there are many different ways to define entrepreneurship and startups, and so it depends on how you want to understand it, and there's in some ways of defining it, there's better definitions, some are far worse definitions, and actually I was mentioning to Eric earlier that data is a big problem when it comes to actually measuring startups, and so there's a good quote that I think everyone should keep in mind when I'm talking about some of the results, which is the physicist Lord Kelvin. He says, when you cannot measure, your knowledge is meager and unsatisfactory. And so I think for a lot of this, we don't really know exactly how to measure startups and entrepreneurship, but we're getting there. And so a lot of our research more recently has been looking at the Inc. 500 data, so data of fast-growing companies over the past several decades. And by looking at that data, we found that, yes, there are certain cities that you would expect, such as like the Bay Area and Boston. But in addition, though, there are many cities that crop up in our data sets that you would not expect. So, for example, Washington, D.C. is actually one of the biggest hosts to Inc. 500 companies. Buffalo, New York, where I'm originally from. Buffalo does quite well, even though people think Buffalo sucks. So that's exciting.
I mean, when you're in Miami, it's...
So, yeah, and there's various other cities in sort of the Rust Belt area. Indianapolis does well. So there's all these different kinds of places that people would not expect. So it seems as if a lot of startups are more geographically dispersed than we might have expected. In addition, we've also looked at certain aspects of mobility. So where people are from versus where they end up choosing to start companies. And one of the ways we've done this is by using the proxy of where people went to school. So where they went to school, where they're educated, where their highest degree was, versus where they ended up starting their first company. And we have a little bit of data on this, and we found that for the most part, people end up starting their companies in the same general region where they went to school. And actually, one of the regions that does the best in our data set is the South. And that's not at all what people might have expected. They might have expected the West or the Northeast. And we've actually found on Miami specific that I believe Miami has been, I think it's the 10th best city in terms of being able to attract founders from other places in terms of where they were educated versus where they went to school. So I think the picture right now is a lot broader than people might expect. But of course, that being said, this is just one way of looking at it. This is the Inc. 500 data. So those companies are a little bit more established. We really can't tell where people are getting their ideas. Like, so when they come up with their idea in the shower, we don't have good data on that. But we're hopefully getting closer.
Hey, Brad, can you hear me okay?
Yep, I can hear you fine.
Great. Brad, I mean, you've written this book about startup ecosystems. Maybe you can just kind of gloss for us the kind of thesis of the book, like why companies tend to cluster in particular places, say Boulder, and why it works, like what drives the communities forward.
So if I can, I'll give you a 4-minute rant on that, since I do also have to drop at 11 for a conference that I'm kicking off.
Cool.
That starts in 6 minutes. I apologize that I have to leave. So I've lived in Boulder since '95. I moved here from Boston, where I lived for 12 years. And I was an entrepreneur in Boston, angel investor, and then became a venture capital investor. I moved to Boulder because my wife told me she was moving to Boulder and I could come with her. So I didn't have any reason other than that to go to Boulder. I didn't know anybody. And when I look back at about 2010, about what had happened in Boulder, it was pretty remarkable to watch, not just since I was there, but the overall growth and development of the startup community in Boulder. I'm a co-founder of a thing called Techstars, which is in a bunch of other cities, and I also have been able to observe the dynamics in larger cities like Boston and New York and Seattle, as well as lots of other cities where I invest, like Portland and Austin. And I've come to the conclusion, it's a deeply held belief, that you can have a startup community in any city in the world. And in fact, every city in the world needs a startup community as part of the fabric of the community to keep the community innovative, regenerating, growing, and expanding over time. I came up with 4 principles which I hope in the future will be completely obvious. Those are, I think, a good framework is one that in hindsight is obvious about how startup communities grow and develop, and I'll just lay them out for you quickly. The first is that the startup community has to be led by entrepreneurs. So there are 2 categories of people in the world around a startup community, and I classify them as leaders and feeders, and they're both critically important, but they play totally different roles. The leaders have to be the entrepreneurs. The feeders are everyone else: government, academia, large companies, venture capitalists, investors. These feeders can't be the leaders. Individual members that are participants that are part of a feeder can play leadership roles, but the leaders have to be a critical mass of entrepreneurs. The second is that those entrepreneurs have to have a long-term commitment to building the startup community. Startups take a long time, 10, 15, 20 years to create, and a startup community takes a long time as well. And it's one of the challenges for the feeders, because many of the feeders are operating on much shorter time cycles. The 2 or 4 years time cycle of government, or the annual rhythm of a university, the measurement that you have to get more investment to continue to invest in something, completely disconnected from the dynamics of the arc of a normal entrepreneurial journey, and hence startup community. The other part of that that's so critical is that most of the feeder organizations have hierarchy. And the hierarchies are fine. It's an organizational model that is important. The startup community is fundamentally a network. And any of us who have experienced the collision of networks and hierarchies know how painful and awkward and uncomfortable that can be. And that's one of the other challenges, is that most hierarchies tend to have much shorter measurement periods for what's going on than networks. The third is that you have to have a view of being inclusive of anyone who wants to engage at any level. I caught the tail end of the previous talk, this notion of openness, this notion of involving anybody who wants to engage. The idea of leveraging as many resources as you can and coming at the entire development of the startup community with that mindset is so critical. And then the last is that you have to have a series of activities and events that engage the entire entrepreneurial stack. So I like to say that Entrepreneur of the Year awards, which every city has had since the beginning of noticing that you should have an awards for entrepreneurs, is nice, and it's flattering, but it's not that important. It's not sufficient. Networking events at rich people's houses to try to connect people together. Okay, that's fine. But what you really want is you want stuff like Startup Weekend, which is a 54-hour simulation of entrepreneurship where anybody who wants to get involved, aspiring entrepreneurs, first-time entrepreneurs, experienced entrepreneurs, can work together to actually create some stuff. Or accelerators like what we've created at Techstars, where you have a 90-day program where 10 companies go through a mentor-driven process. It's a full-time, immersive process. We fund them. They come out the other end having had their companies accelerate. And there's a long list of these things. The powerful thing is that they're entrepreneur-led. So all the feeder organizations can provide lots of support, infrastructure, sponsorship, involvement, and engagement. But there is no president of a startup community. And there is no vice president of membership and no vice president of education. It's just this messy, sloppy network of interconnected entrepreneurs doing things within the context of a particular city. So those are the four principles. Again, hopefully they become obvious in hindsight, and I apologize for having to split. Hopefully you guys have a nice day and a good conference.
Thank you, Brad. Same to you.
Thanks for letting me chime in for a few minutes.
Adriana, can we talk a little bit about Miami? So, given what you've heard, given what you know about the startup community, can you lay it out for us? Like, what's the kind of map of this kind of startup world, and what's the pitch for Miami? Why here versus?
Why not? Miami has always been a startup city. What is changing is the type of businesses that we want to support. If you go back to the 1500s, Miami was actually discovered by a Spanish guy called Ponce Leon, who came over from Puerto Rico and decided to do a settlement here. And in the course of the next 300 years, you had the Brits and the French and the Spanish all fighting to be able to control this amazing piece of land. And the reason they wanted to do that was because it was seen as sort of this key geographic point in which they could connect the old world with the new world. And it had to do with trade, it had to do with passageways and all these other things. So I actually think that the startup feeling and that energy has been here for a very, very, very long time. I think technology and sort of the digital stuff that we're interested in now is demanding of a city a bunch of new things, which is sort of mostly what we're talking about here to be able to support that. From personal experience, we set up offices here. I'm from Venezuela, and we set up offices here 40 years ago because we had pan-regional desire, and we thought that it was easier to run our business from Miami towards Latin America and to deal with the U.S. Hispanic back then because the flight connections weren't as good. 40 years later, we've established our headquarters here because it's still easy if you want to be involved in the U.S. In our case, the U.S. Hispanic market is very important, and you want to maintain a global approach to the way that you see Latin America. Miami's the perfect place to do that. The elements are in place. I think you definitely need a critical mass of entrepreneurs to get the ball going, right? And you need institutional support. You need support from educational places to make sure that we're training all the right people. But to make the leap from startups and supporting entrepreneurial efforts that are not that big, to really be able to have somebody like Endeavor come and decide to launch Endeavor Miami, which is an extraordinary accomplishment, it means that they've decided that this city is ready to support high-impact, high-growth entrepreneurship. And that's a game changer. It helps the Knight Foundation is here to make that happen. And the missing link that we still have is what are we going to do to be able to really attract and make VCs be comfortable here so that they come with the big checks and they want to finance those businesses that are coming out of Miami or out of Latin America using Miami as a base. yeah, I would say that's probably the most important thing that we need to really work at. And I actually think, going back to sort of to this geographic magic of Miami, for all of us in South America, Miami is really nearby. We grow up always looking at Miami being right there. For a lot of people in the East Coast or in the West Coast, South America is actually really far away. So I think if all of us could get together and say, you know what, Miami for the next 5 or 10 years, until people really get comfortable with traveling and spending time in Latin America, let's make this the meeting place where we can unite the entrepreneurs that are coming from South America with the investors that are coming from Europe and from the US, and have this be the place where that magic happens and the major financing comes through.
That's interesting. Erica, I want to take a slightly different turn and think about some of the other ways that the, I guess, feeders in Brad's terminology can kind of play into a system like this. I mean, what do we know about the things that universities and other support institutions can do to foster these entrepreneurial ecosystems?
Yeah, one of the themes this morning, Mayor Diaz spoke powerfully to it, I think, is the notion of change that our society is going through right now. And I don't think any institution in our society is going to feel that change more powerfully than the university over the coming years. If you think about the educational mission of the university, right now in this country there's $1 trillion of student debt. I mean, that's a staggering number. The national debt's $16.5 trillion. There's $1 trillion in student debt. That's clearly an unsustainable business model. I don't know where the massive online open course movement is going, but it's going someplace, right? The ground is absolutely shifting under our feet. If I think about the research mission of the university, a mission that's supported through the largesse of the taxpayers of this country, I think that society has a difficult set of decisions to make about how to allocate scarce resources among a much greater number of needs than there are to support. And so I think that in order to remain relevant, the university is going to have to do a much better job of making clear its value proposition to society. I say all the time, and I absolutely believe it, that if we can't be clear to plumbers in Iowa why them giving us their tax dollars is an important thing for them to do, they're simply going to shut us down. And so at Duke, the Innovation and Entrepreneurship Initiative is really premised on the notion that to stay relevant in the 21st century, the university has to change and its relationship with society has to change. We have to shift from a position where we see the creation of knowledge as our core mission to a position where we recognize as an absolutely critical part of that core mission the translation of those ideas into actions and into things that make a real difference to real people's lives, right? And that is a fundamental shift that has to happen. And it's the translation of ideas that gives those ideas meanings, that brings them to life. If we can effect that shift, if we can move the university to a place where we see, for instance, that a critical part of our mission is to take new scientific knowledge and to turn it into real things that make a real difference to real people's lives, then I think we can be an incredibly important part of that feeder ecosystem in the I&E world.
Sam, do we think that universities, great research universities, are sort of necessary as a sort of component of a startup ecosystem? Or do we think they just sort of happen to be located near most startup hubs?
So I definitely think that the universities generate a lot of value in terms of providing technologies. That being said, I don't know if necessarily the vast majority, but a lot of technologies in universities that are developed, they don't actually get licensed or transferred. So there's a lot of things remaining on the shelf. And so oftentimes when you look and you see that a lot of successful startup ecosystems have universities, it seems to us that one of the things that we think is most important is actually not the technologies and the research coming out of there, but it's a funnel for new and young people. So it's just creating the churn. And so if you look at a lot of the places where there are successful startup ecosystems, there's a lot of people moving in, there's a lot of people moving out, and that helps bring, and as people were talking about it earlier, it creates a lot of collisions, people with different ideas and new perspectives. And I think that's what universities can actually catalyze. They can actually bring a lot of new people. And so whether or not they're in the research lab doing specific scientific research, or simply just being there and colliding with other people, I think the collisions and the funnel is the most important feature of a university in helping that ecosystem.
You know, one thing I was thinking about, relative to Boulder, Portland, Austin, Seattle, like if you think about those cities versus Miami, I mean, I grew up near there.
Better weather?
Well, yeah, much better weather here, but, it's kind of a lot of white boys in hoodies, right? I mean, that's kind of what's going on up there. And here you have a really different mix of cultures. You have a really different mix of languages. How, in Miami, as sort of the capital of Latin America kind of idea, how do you see translating, all this mix of different cultures with the sort of Silicon Valley hoodie guys, I mean, do you see interface points that are easy around businesses or particular industries?
Yeah, at the end, the reason Miami is interesting and the reason Miami is leapfrogging and reinvents itself every 10 years is because there are these very strong mixtures of communities, and that has been the case for a very, very long time. I think Miami is the perfect place because of those reasons to be the meeting place, the presenter, where you can actually bring the Silicon Valley people to understand how to look at businesses in Latin America, and I think that's a very valuable thing. Miami has passed, I think in the 80s and the 90s, you would say it was a very transient city, and people sort of came and went. That's not the case anymore. A lot of the people here are incredible entrepreneurs who have chosen to stay here, who have become fully committed to making the city a great place, and it has a lot to do with the city deciding that we need better culture and that it needs to be deep and it has to go beyond our Basel. That's happening. We need good food. We really need good schools. The magnet schools here are incredible. The private schools are getting better and they're being more progressive in how they approach education. And that's the stuff that's making a lot of the leaders here feel very comfortable, making of Miami a true permanent home. That's a game changer. And it's still a great intersection point as they look south.
I think a kind of big picture question, and actually I'm not even going to quite go to it because I think we're trying to speed up things and go to Q&A if people have a question. Okay, great. We've got one right there.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. My name is Aleda Lanza, and I am with Autism U. We are a startup that is launching at the University of Miami Card Center next week. One of the things that, thank you, we're hoping to crowdsource autism research, and in part of that process, we'd also like to introduce a technology that we've so far haven't been able to get a response from either local or state or county government, and it includes an application that was created by a fire chief in San Francisco that is already launched in several cities. And it's a citizens alert app, much like an Amber Alert. However, you can use it for CPR, and what we want to try to develop is also an alert system for wanderers. Now, it's free. It has been recognized by ABC, CBS, NBC, and Fords. And we'd like to know how we can try to have like an innovation czar or someone that we can go to that we can, have like a go-to person in county or city or state government that will translate the possibility of these applications. Even when they're free, we can't get a response.
So maybe the question is, what's the role of sort of a local regional government to support some of the new applications that are coming up? Anyone want to take that one?
Well, I'm happy to answer that. I think, the first thing that you have to make sure is that your app is actually really great. And that beyond it being a great idea and something that seems to be needy, that it needs to be sticky. You need to pay attention. You need to hire a gamification expert that can really make that interaction work. And perhaps one step before you get to the point where you're trying to convince the government to support your app is to actually work with an incubator to see if they can really try to see, how they can improve your app and put you in that network of people that are going to support you in that endeavor. At that point, if you can show stickiness or why there's such a need for this app, I'm sure, governments, institutions, and so forth it would be much easier for them to support you.
Yeah, I just say, having been to a few cities, that the role of government, particularly the local government, is quite mixed in lots of places, and it doesn't really seem like You know, in some places it seems like it's really helpful, in other places it doesn't seem like it does much, in other places it seems like actively detracting, but it's kind of smallish in the overall scheme of things.
My name is David McDonald with Project Lift. I have a question with regard to the idea of entrepreneurs and feeders, and you think about the definition of entrepreneurs in many ecosystems where there are startups, e-hours, entrepreneurs in residence being entrepreneurs who've had exits and so on and so forth. How do you distinguish, or what do you mean when you say entrepreneurs need to lead? And how do you distinguish an entrepreneur in that case?
I wish we had Brad to answer that here. Who wants to, anyone want to take a shot at that?
I mean, I think there's you know, the notion that there is a phenotype that, you know, seems to have an inherent sense of how to take an idea and to drive it forward to market. And those groups of people are incredibly important, and we can all sit here and list names of people who have been serial entrepreneurs and have been highly successful. I think that what's critical is to be able to have those people living in an ecosystem where there's lots of opportunities for them to take things forward. And
cool. Just to piggyback on that, and you need to have the entrepreneurs as an integral part, mainly because otherwise, whether it's government or academics, they're going to just be talking about all these things, and they don't actually know them. And so you need to actually make sure the people who are doing these things are involved. Otherwise, you're going to create all these wonderful programs that are useless. And that's a big problem.
Yeah, I like to say that institutions and governments and universities are there to support entrepreneurs.
Yes.
They're not there to create the world that entrepreneurs need to live in. And it's important to keep that energy going in that way.
Great. I think we will end there. You're about to hear from Emily Badger's next panel. Thank you very much.